We're on Daf Samaches, and we'll start on the second line, V'acheresh. The Mishnah said that a cheresh is posel v'eno machil. And the Gemara is now going to analyze in what scenario is the cheresh posel, and in what scenario eno machil. Ibas Kohen li Yisrael he. If his wife is a Bas Kohen and she's married to Yisrael, so now that she's married to Yisrael, she loses her rights, her abilities to Truma, Pasale. So the husband, even though he is a Cheresh, nevertheless, the Rabbanan recognized the marriage of a cheresh, and the fear is that if she continues to eat truma, she might feed the truma to her husband or any other members of his family, and therefore cheresh hakanya b'takanta d'Rabbanan. Rabbanan recognized that marriage, and therefore Rabbanan she becomes psula L'truma, as if she were married to a Yisrael. She's not really technically married to Yisrael. Cheresh is a la bardas, but the Rabbanon recognized that marriage. Ve'ibas Yisrael lekohen he. If she is a bas Yisrael married to a cheresh who's a kohen, lo machil. Nevertheless, even though she's married to a Kohen, and the Rabbanan recognize that marriage, even though he's a cheresh, is she cannot eat truma, because on a doraisa level, she's not married to a Kohen. And the Torah says, Kinyan kaspom omrachmana, v'hai lav bar kinyanhu. This Kohen could not have kinyan kaspom because he's a lav bar das, he's not capable of owning anything. The Mishnah continues, "Ben teisha shonim posel v'eno machil." So we're not sure what this means. At this point, the Gemara understands that we're talking b'shomeres yavam, a woman whose husband died, and she's waiting for yibum from his brother. And the brother is only 9 years old and 1 day. And the Yibum has not been implemented. And the Mishnah says that if she's a Bas Kohen and he, the Yavam, is Yisrael, then the fact that she is Kuka, on a Dorais level, she has a Zika of Yibum to a Yisrael, that passes her for Truma. On the other hand, if he's a Kohen, Zika to a Kohen is not enough of an ishus to allow it to eat Truma. So the Gemara asks the immediate question, Lamai, regarding what din does the Mishnah say that only a Katan ben Teisha shonim v'yom echad is posel v'eno machil? And the Mishnah seems to imply some sort of new din that applies because the Kohen, the Yavam, is a Katan, or if he's a Yisrael, is a Ben Tes. What's the significance of the fact that the Yavam is a Ben Tes? He's not older or younger. Ila Mifsal, if the Mishnah is saying that since she's Kuka to a Yavam, who is a Yisrael, and he's Roy Labia, because after 9 years and 1 day, the halacha, the Torah recognizes his Bia, and therefore, even though she's a Kohenes, but since she's Kuka to a Yavam Yisrael, who's a Bar Bia, therefore she's possibly truma. Are you telling me that only because he's 9 years old, katan in this context means even if he's less than 9 years old, nami mifsal pasal. Why? Because the Torah recognizes the zika to a yavam, even if the yavam is 1 day old. And since the yavam in this context is a Yisrael, that zika to a Yisrael will undermine her kashrus l'truma. So once again, we don't understand why the Mishnah emphasizes that he's ben tes. V'ili ochle, and if it's a case where the yavam is not a Yisrael but rather a Kohen, and she's a Bas Yisrael, and the yavam who's a Kohen who's now 9 years old cannot be machil hatruma, is gadol nami lo machil. Even if he was older and he was a gadol, the din would be the same. And that is that zikas yibum is not enough, is not intense enough of an ishus to be machil a bas Yisrael truma. So again, what's the significance of the age 9 years and 1 day? Omar Abaye, the Mishnah is not talking about a shomeres yavam, but hacha bi yavam ben teisha shon v'yom echad haba al yevim to askina. We're talking not before the bia, but rather after the bia. The yavam is a Kohen, she's a Bas Yisrael, and the yavam is 9 years old and 1 day. Midoraisa kanyule. On a doraisa level, the bia of a yavam who's 9 years old is konen. And salka daitachamina, I would have argued whole midoraisa kanyule biasa bia. Ema lochil, why shouldn't she truma? She is basically Kinyan Kaspa. She's married to a Kohen, even though he's only 9 years old, but it doesn't matter because the Torah recognizes his Kinyan power through his Bia in a Yavam, in a Yibum situation. So certainly I would think that she could now eat Truma. And this little Kohen who's only 9 years old will be Machil, his Yevamot Truma, after he consummated Bia and was Kona Hamidaraisa, Kamash Malan. But now the Mishnah is telling me a chidush that even though it's true that the Torah recognizes the kinyan of a katan ben teisha in bias yibum, nevertheless the Chachamim downgraded the status of his bia. The asu bias ben teisha shanam yom echad kimaimer begadol. They established, we have to figure out why, that the bia of a benteisha of a yavam is equivalent to the mimer, which is kedusha kesef or shtar of a gadol, of a yavam gadol, and that's not enough to be machil ha truma to the yavama, because on a doraisa level, all that she has is a zika to a kohen, and ishus she doesn't have because the mimer is not chal on a doraisa level. And now we understand why the Mishnah mentions a katan ben tes. In order to be machadish a chidush, that even though the bia of a katan ben tes in the case of Yibum is considered a kinyan doraisa, nevertheless the Mishnah wants to say that midrabanan she cannot eat truma, even though she's kinyan kaspo doraisa of a kohen. That's as far as the halacha of eno machil. As far as the halacha of katan posel, then enochinami, any zika whatsoever to a non-kohen would passel a bas kohen from truma, whether he's 9 years old or he's 1 day old. So there's no chiddush of ben teisha with regard to posel. But since the Mishnah wants to be machadish the din of eno machil, when the katan yavam ben teisha consummated the yibum, with a Maisa Bia and was Kohen Doraisa, and yet the Rabbanan downgraded it to the level of Maimer Begadol. So Agav Urcha, the Mishnah mentions the flip side. In the case of a Bas Kohen who fell to Yibum to a Yavam Yisrael, that she becomes possibly Truma by virtue of the Zika to a Yisrael. And in this context, again, it makes no difference whether he's 1 day old or 9 years old. But the Mishnah wants to be consistent and mention the case of a 9-year-old. But the real chiddush of the Mishnah regarding a 9-year-old is with regard to a Yavam who's a Katan, who's a Kohen, and has already consummated the Yibum with a Bia that the Torah recognizes that generates a Kinyan Dorai. So she would be able to eat Truma as a Bas Kohen, Hanesua Yisrael, Aknuya Yisrael Midin Kinyan Kaspo, and the Rabbanon removed the status of Kinyan on a Rabbanon level and downgraded it to the level of Maimer Begod. Amalei Rava. Rava turns to Abayit with the following objection. Ihachi, if the Mishnah only mentions Katan ben Teisha v'yom Echad for the din of Eno Machil, that even though the Yavam is a Kohen, he cannot be Machil the Yevamot, in this case the Bas Yisrael Truma, but as far as the din of posel, we don't need a ben Teisha. It's irrelevant whether he's 1 day or 9 years old. Then what's difficult now is the Seifa. The Katani, it says in the Seifa, Safek ben Teisha shanim v'yom echad, Safek eno, meaning maybe he's not ben Teisha v'yom echad. It's like whenever I learn this Gemara, I think of my father. We never knew my father's birthday. He never knew birthday. Back in Europe, where he was born in Lita, they didn't make any calculations about any records about when his birthday was. So he never knew his birthday. We only sort of, we had about a 2-week period of time where we thought it was his birthday. Anyway, so here's a child. We don't know when his birthday was. We don't know if he's 9 years old or not. And his din, says the Mishnah, in a suffix situation, is we consider him as if he was a ben teisha v'yom echad. So Rav asks Abaye, what chidush do we have in this case of a suffix ben teisha shanim she'eno machil? Because again, according to Abaye, the entire subject of the Mishnah, the thrust of the Mishnah, the chidush of the Mishnah, is that this Yavam who's a Kohen is not machil. Hashta vaday ben teisha lo machil safek mi boy. Did the Mishnah have to go ahead and tell me? Again, on a Doraisa level, he's only machil because he's ben teisha, and the Mishnah tells me that Rabbanan, even though he's ben teisha and he's machil because the Kinyan Doraisa, nevertheless the Rabbanan removed it. If he was less than ben teisha, then for sure she's not a machil because his bia is not a bia and he's not Kohen, and all she has is a zika. So certainly there's no issues to be machil. So why would the Mishnah have to bother telling me the case of a suffix machil, where mimanav shach? If he was already ben teisha, then we already know that the Rabbanon, as established in the Reish of the Mishnah, downgraded his status to maimer begadol, and he cannot be a machil. If he was less than a ben teisha, then all you have is zika, and even on a deraisa level, he's not a machil. So obviously, a suffix ben teisha is no machil. If a vade ben teisha, which again is a malyusa, that's a plus because he's a bar bia and he's not machil, even though with deraisa he was konahar. Then how much more so on the side that he's less than ben teisha, where there never was a hava. I mean, even on a deraisa level, he would be a machil. So therefore, Rava now has to find a different alternative interpretation of our Mishnah. Ela Omar Rava ben Teisha Shonim Yom Echad. The Hanach Sulim Katani. So we're now going back to the case of Psulim, which we haven't discussed now, excuse me, until this point. By the way, even though I'm having a little trouble with my voice, I tested negative, so don't worry about it. I got back the results this morning. In the last 4 days, I tested negative twice, once on the way out, once on the way back in. Okay.
So we don't have to wear a mask for the Zoom.
Right, you don't have to wear a mask for the Zoom. But the reason why my voice is a little bit weak is because I spoke 7 times over Shabbos. Okay. In any event, getting back to our sheet of Rava and his interpretation of the Mishnah, we're talking about the poslim. And we're going to have a brisa coming around the bend that lists the poslim, or shall we call it the psulim, that are posel bibiyasam es ha'isha milinase lekoe, or to eat truma forever and ever. She becomes a chalol. The posle bibiyasam. If the katan has already reached the age of 9, and the Torah recognizes his bia as a valid bia, then, like a gadol who's already bar mitzvah, he passes these ladies in a case where the Yavam ben Teisha was ba al Yevimta. He passes her, she's a Kohenes, she's a Bas Kohen, from Truma, and from ever marrying a Kohen. Forever and ever. But that's only because his bia is a bia poseles, because he is a ben teisha v'yom echad. If he's less than ben teisha v'yom echad, then he doesn't passel her, neither for truma nor for getting married to a Kohen. And if he was a suffix ben teisha and he has a relationship with her, the Mishnah says midin suffix that maybe he's already a ben teisha, he passes her for truma and for marrying a Kohen. Kedesanya, like we learned in the Bryce. Ben Teisha Shonim Yom Echad, Ger Amoni, Umo Avi. Umo Avi means or he's a Ger Mo Avi. And again, although, as we'll have on Shavuos with Megillas Ruach, say Moaviyah is allowed to marry into Klal Yisrael after she undergoes Gerus, but not the male member of Moav or Ammon. They are excluded forever and ever, even after Gerus, from entering into Klal Yisrael, marrying a Jewish girl. Or we have a Mitzri Vadomi Ad Dar Shlishi. The Torah says that if a Mitzri is Misgayer, then we have to wait till his grandchildren to allow them to marry, or an Adomi Adar Shlishi. So we're now talking less than the 9-year-old boy is a Ger Mitzri, or the son of a Ger Mitzri, an Adomi, a Ger Adomi, or the son of a Ger Adomi, but we're still within that less than the 3 dar range. Or we have the case of a Kusi or a Nosin. Okay, Kusi is a big business, a whole to do about exactly the status of a Kusi. The Kusim were the Shomronim who had Gerus because they were afraid of the lions that were attacking the enemies of the Jews. And the Gemara Kedushin Ayin Haman Beis records Machlokes Tanoim as to whether they Gerei Arayos are considered like Goyim or they are considered Gerei Emes. And now our Brisa understands that Kusim are Gerei Arayos, that Gerus is invalid, and the Torah says Lo Tischatein Bam, and they're not allowed to enter into the Jewish folk and have a relationship with a woman because their Gerus is invalid. They basically have the status of a guy. Then we have something called the Nosin, which are the Givonim, who are amongst the 7 nations that occupied Palestine, and they were underwent Gerus, and David and his Bezdin made a Gzera that they cannot come into the Kohol, and they are called Nesinim because they gave Yoshua appointed them as Chotvei Eitzim V'Shoavei Mayim. So Nosnam Yoshua, Chotvei Eitzim V'Shoavei Mayim, they were the ones who tricked the Jewish people, etc., etc., and therefore Yoshua made a Gzera, and they're not allowed to enter into the Jewish folk. If any of the above, including now a Cholol or a Mamzer, a Cholol is someone who's born from Isurei Kahuna, let's say a Grucha was married to a Kohen, the child of that marriage is a Cholol. If it's a Bas, she's a Chalola. And a Mamzer who's not allowed to enter into the Kol, any of the above, this entire list, starting with Yeramoni Umoavi, all the way down to Mamzer Shebo al Kohenes Levia B'Yisraelis Pisalua, this Bas Kohen becomes Psula Litruma, or to marry a Kohen. She has the status of a Chalola. In all the above cases after the Bia is a Bia Aposteles, or in the case of Levia and Yisraelis, she is now also Linase Lekahuna Li Olam. She can never marry a Kohen as a result of this Bia. And according to Rava, in all of these cases, we have the Mishnah establishing Pasle Bibiyasam if the Boel is a Ben Tesha V'Yom Echad or a Safek Ben Tesha V'Yom Echad. So the Gemara raises the following objection. How can you tell me that the Mishnah is talking about a case of Bia Poseles V'Midaktani Seifa? The next Mishnah, which is recorded on Daf Samach Tes, says, if this woman had a be'ila le'ena ra'uya lava b'kol areim poslim, your case is addressed in the Seifa, which is the Mishnah on Samach Tes. How can you tell me that the Reisha here on Samach Tes is talking about the exact same case? Michal the Reisha la b'psula maskina, but rather like Abaye had interpreted, we're talking about a Yevamot. And the Gemara answers that we need 2 Mishnayos that address the question of an Isha Shenivala Lepasul, because there are 2 scenarios, or 2 kinds or categories of psul. There's number 1, psulim lovo bekal Yisrael, that pasul with that bia. And then there's a category of people who are allowed to enter in Klal Yisrael, but yet they nevertheless pasul lekahuna, and their bia passes the woman to truma and to get married to kahuna as a chalal. So let's say, for example, a chalal who is born from an illegitimate kahuna marriage, meaning his father's a Kohen, his mother's a grusha, he was born from that wedding, from that wedlock. He is a chalal. He's allowed to marry any Jewish girl. He's just not considered part of Klal Yisrael. I'm sorry. He's part of Klal Yisrael. He's just excluded from kahuna. Reisha b'psulei kol, Seifa b'psulei kahuna. Our Reisha is addressing the case. This is a lowercase chidush, less of a chidush, where the Ben Tesha was a mamzer, for example, or he was a ger, Amoni Moavi, Mitzri Vadomi, Kusi V'Nosin, mamzer, all the above are psulei kol, and they passel her b'yasam as a chalola. The Seifa of that Mishnah is talking about a man who's mutal of a makol, but he's a chalal, he's psulei kahuna, and likewise his bia passels his wife to truma and to marry a Kohen. The only thing that bothers me is they the Reish itself on its list has cholol on it. So why are you telling me I need the Sefer to teach me cholol? I suspect, but I'm not finding it right now. I'll try to get back to you on this, that the Gemara's final answer is that we take cholol out of the Reish of the Mishnah and we put it into the Sefer of the Mishnah. Let me just take a quick peek here in the Masechet if he points out there's some sort of girsa change. Do you have, I always forget if you have footnotes, so you could look for this also. If is the Gemara changing the girsa here? He's addressing a slightly different issue here. Which Mishnah came first, Psulei Kol or Psulei Kahuna? Okay, I don't want to hold us up, but I think the Gemara is now leaving out Cholol from the Reish and putting it into the Sefer Gufa. The Gemara now quotes the Brisa that we had quoted earlier, Ben Teisha Shanav Yom Echad Ger Amoni Moavi Mitzri Adomi Kusi Nosin Chol Mams Deshapo Al Kohenes or Levia V'Yisraelis Psoluha. So this Kohenes can no longer eat Truma. She can no longer marry a Kohen. If she's a Levia or Yisraelis, she can no longer marry a Kohen. Rabbi Yossi Omer, Rabbi Yosef is the dissenting opinion. Not all of the above posel are posel. Kol zaro posel, posel, but kol ain't zaro posel, ain't no posel. But let's say, for example, you had a second generation Mitzri Va'adomi. So his child would be already a third generation, and they would be kosher l'kol. So according to Rabbi Yossi, in such a case, even the second generation, since it's Zaro Eno Posel, would not Posel Bibiyasa. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer, again, not every Posel would Posel the Isha, but rather Dafka Kol Shatanose Bito. What does that mean? Kol Shatanose Bito. Klomar, Kol Psul Shebito Muteres Lekuhuna. If his daughter could marry a Kohen, and this is the case of Ger Ammoni Umoavi, where the Torah allows a Moaviyah or an Ammoniyah to marry into Klal Yisrael. And that's called Bito Muteres Lekuhuna. I mean, that's right. That's the case of Rus, that she's allowed to bow the call, even though she was from Moab, but a Moaviyah is not included. And in such a case, says Reb Shimon Gamliel, the father, who is a Ger Ammoni Umoavi, whose daughter would not be excluded from Kol, he does not pasel the Truma or Lekuhuna. Atanose Alminosa. His marriage does not pasel Lekuhuna, and therefore, if he dies, he'd be allowed to marry a Kohen. Basically, what Rabbi Shimon Gamliel is saying is the very fact that his daughter is kosher l'kol indicates that he's not a full-fledged posel l'kol. There's something like there are gradations of psul kol. There's a psul kol whose children are posel l'kol. There's a psul kol whose children are kosher l'kol. And in the middle you have psul kol, whose daughter is kosher l'kol, although his son is excluded from kol. It's kol she'ein ata nosei es bito, iata nosei alminaso. In other words, if the psul extends not only to the son but also to the daughter, then says Reb Shimon, the almana of this person is pasul through the bia. Ask me, nani bili. How do we know that through a beila to a pasul, she becomes excluded to kahuna? And the Gemara answers, Omar Rabbi Yehuda Marav, Omar Kra, Ubas Kohen Kisiya Leish Zar. And the question here is, this is the pasuk that we read on Shabbos here in Eretz Yisrael, not where I was. I missed Parshas Emor. Anyway, Ish Zar is considered Yesh Zarus Bibiasa. And we darshan that she cannot marry him. And the pasuk concludes by saying, He betrumas hakochim lo sochal, kevad shenival apostle psola. Once she has a bia to this apostle, she herself becomes disqualified from eating truma. Now, by introduction to the next kasha of the Gemara, we'll mention the following introduction that's offered here in the Masechet. A bas Kohen who gets married to someone who's not a Kohen is not allowed to eat truma as long as her marriage is still alive and active. But after he dies or he divorces her, then it depends. If she has children from this Yisrael, her ex-husband, she's not allowed to eat truma because of her child. If she doesn't have any children, she goes back to her father's bias, and once again she eats truma. So that's the case of a bas Kohen hanises lizar, and this is derived again in Parshas Emor. It says ubas Kohen kisiya leish zar he betrumas hakadoshim lo sochel. Ubas Kohen kisi almano grusha v'zera ein lo. Then v'shovel beis avia kinureh milechem avia tochel v'chol zar liochel. So Gemara asks the following question: Hi, that pasuk ubas Kohen is not, as we saw earlier, redundant. That allows us to darshan that and derive the halacha that nivela lepasla pasla. Miboile, I need it for something else. Namely, the Ka'amar Achmanu Bas Kohen the Minza Volazar Lo Teichel. We're talking about a Bas Kohen who's been eating truma all her life. Now she gets married to Yisrael. She doesn't eat truma. And that's called Kisiya Leish Zar. This is not telling me anything about Nivel Apostle. The Gemara answers, Hahi, that din of a bas Kohen that got married to a zar doesn't eat truma, that we derive from a different pasuk. Miveshavel beis avia, if she gets divorced from her non-Kohen husband, she returns to her father's rishus kinureo milechem avia tochel. Right, because the Torah could have told me that a bas Kohen who's married to Yisrael cannot eat truma. She's asur b'truma. So mida kamer achmona, from the fact that the Torah said that a bas Kohen who was married to Yisrael and Yisrael died, v'chavel beis avia kinureh tochel, she can eat truma. Only when she goes back to beis avia she eats truma. But until the marriage terminates, while the marriage is still alive and well and active to a Yisrael, Michlal we derive to mikara lo achla, she can't eat truma. Therefore, the pasuk bas Kohen kisiya leish zar, which concludes by telling me that he betrumas kadoshim lo sochel, that's completely redundant. I could already derive it from the implication of Vishavel Beis Avia, then Tochel. But if she hasn't returned to Beis Avia, she's still married to Yisrael, she's not allowed to eat Truma. So why did the Torah have to add the pasuk of Ubas Kohen Kisi Elish Zar? It must be that in this context, we're not talking about a marriage to an Ish Zar, but rather a Be'ila to an Ish Zar. And that passes so from eating Truma. And the Gemara rejects it. The pasuk Ubas Kohen is not superfluous. We need it to derive the halacha that Bas Kohen, right? So now we get into the whole issue about whether we have an essay or a lotase. If we're deriving it from an implication of a shavel Beis Avia, meaning until that point, as long as the marriage is still valid and alive, she cannot eat truma, that's not a lotase. If we're going to derive it by implication from the shavel Beis Avia, Hava Mina would have come to the conclusion that she doesn't get malchus if she continues eating truma, because it's only a lav haba michal essay. And what's the status of a lav haba michal essay, a do not, that is derived by implication from a do? That's not more than an essay. You don't get malchus for such. So if you're deriving that she, as a Bas Kohen married to a Zar, could not eat truma until she goes back to Beis Avia when that marriage terminates, then that would, in the worst case scenario, be a violation of an essay. And therefore, Kosav Rachmana Hai, now I need a lotas. So where do I get the lotas? Ubas Kohen Kisia Leish Zar, he betrumas hakadoshim lo tochel. Lo tochel is a lotas. Lila, to teach me that she gets malchus. So you have no right to derive from this pasuk the conclusion that nivel l'apostla, she becomes excluded from kahuna. And the Gemara answers, no, I still don't need a Bas Kohen to prohibit a Bas Kohen married to Israel in a lav, because the lav can be derived may v'chol zar lo yochal kodesh nafta. That kodesh is truma. And the Torah says that a zar is not allowed to eat kodesh. Now, she's a Bas Kohen. She's not a zar. But once she's married to Yisrael, she becomes a zar. And she's not allowed to eat truma, like any zar, non-Kohen. So by birth, she's a Kohen, a Bas Kohen. But by virtue of her marriage to Yisrael, she's considered like a zar. Once we consider her like a zar, we put her back into the lav of kol zar lo yochal ki kodeshu. And therefore, once again, the pasuk of Ubas Kohen, etc., is superfluous. We could derive the law from the pasuk kol zar lo yochal kodesh. Let's just make a note over here that the pasuk that from which we're deriving the halacha of nivel apostla is, again, all the psukim we're dealing with are in the 22nd chapter in Vayikra, but that pasuk is pasuk Yud Beis. And Kol Zar Lo Yochal Kodesh is earlier in the parsha, in pasuk Yud. So therefore, once we get Vishavel Beis Avia, from which we derive the essay that until she goes back to Beis Avia, she's not allowed to eat truma because she's married to a zar, that already indicates she has a status of a zar. And now when we rewind to pasuk Yud, which says Kol Zar Lo Yochal Kodesh, we now know that she's a zar. The essay, derived by implication from Vishavel Beis Avia, is enough to teach me that her status is that of a zar. So I can go back to pasuk Yud, Kol Zar Lo Yochal Kodesh, and we have a lav now for a Bas Yisrael married to a Kohen to eat truma. Now that middle pasuk that's sandwiched in the middle of Bas Kohen Kisia Lish Zar, etc., is completely redundant because I've already derived a lav from the combination of Shavel Beis Avia going back to Kol Zar Lo Yochal Kodesh. So the pasuk of Bas Kohen Kisia Lish Zar is talking about a case of a bas kohen who was nivala lepasula, and that's going to pasel her from truma and from kahuna forever and ever.